On the frigid autumn night of 1892, Sarah Whitmore's wedding ring left a permanent indent in her swollen finger where the metal had cut too deep into flesh that would never heal properly. Her name was Sarah Elizabeth Whitmore, 18 years old, living on a 500-acre property in Cedar Hollow, Tennessee, where the Whitmore family had isolated themselves for 3 generations. The ring appeared without ceremony, without witnesses, without any record in the county courthouse books. Tell me in the comments your city and the exact time on your clock right now. How many names in that family Bible should never have been written on the same page? The Whitmore property stretched across mountain land, ringed by oak and pine woods, so dense that neighbors could barely glimpse the main house through the trees. Joshua Whitmore, 45 years old, with prematurely gray hair and hands scarred by decades of farm work, ruled the property with absolute authority. His wife, Martha, 40, had grown increasingly pale and withdrawn over the years, rarely speaking above a whisper. The house itself sat in a natural hollow, accessible only by a winding dirt road that discouraged visitors. 2 stories of weathered wood planks, 17 windows facing different directions, and a cellar that extended deeper underground than anyone outside the family knew. The front porch held exactly 3 rocking chairs, though only 2 had been used in recent years. Sarah had always been described by the few who met her as intelligent but submissive, with golden hair that caught sunlight and blue eyes that seemed to hold secrets. Her younger brother Thomas, 16, worked the fields with mechanical precision, never questioning his father's increasingly strange demands. Little Elizabeth, 12, had begun showing signs of delayed development that worried even the family's rare visitors. The first sign something was wrong came when Martha Whitmore stopped appearing at the general store for winter supplies. She had always made the trip in December, buying flour, salt, and lamp oil for the cold months ahead. The store clerk, Henry Bramwell, noted her absence in his ledger, with a simple question mark next to the Whitmore account. That winter, neighbors began hearing sounds from the Whitmore property that didn't match normal farm activity. Sharp cries that echoed through the valley on windless nights. The sound of hammering that went on for hours after sunset. Most disturbing of all, the sound of a woman weeping that seemed to come from underground. The air carried the smell of wet earth and something metallic that made dogs refuse to walk near the property line. Spring brought new revelations when Sarah discovered documents hidden in the attic that changed everything she believed about her family's history. The papers, wrapped in oiled cloth and tied with string, revealed birth certificates with dates that made no sense, marriage records that violated every tongue, law of the state, and a family tree drawn in fading ink that showed connections no decent family would ever acknowledge. The first document was a birth certificate dated 1874, listing Joshua Whitmore as Sarah's father and a woman named Rebecca Whitmore as her mother. But Rebecca was listed on another document as Joshua's sister. The second paper showed Martha's real relationship to the family, not as Joshua's wife, but as his daughter, from an earlier union that had produced 3 children before Sarah was born. Thomas found Sarah reading these documents one morning and broke down, admitting he had overheard conversations between their parents about keeping the bloodline pure. He had been told he would marry Elizabeth when she turned 16, just as Joshua had married Martha, just as every generation of Whitmores had married within the family for 70 years. The ring on Sarah's finger was not new, but an heirloom that had belonged to 7 generations of Whitmore women. Each had worn it in marriages that violated the laws of God and man. Each had produced children with deformities that grew worse with each generation. Each had died young, worn down by pregnancies that should never have happened. In the cellar, Sarah discovered a chest buried beneath loose floorboards that contained the belongings of these women. Dresses that had never been worn outside the property, jewelry that had never been seen in public, letters addressed to relatives who had never received them, Most chilling of all, a diary written in a dozen different hands, all documenting the same horrific pattern, repeating across decades. The diary entries revealed the truth about the family structure Sarah had always accepted. Joshua was not her father, but her grandfather. The man she called father was actually her biological father, a distinction that made her marriage not just inappropriate, but illegal under every law of Tennessee. Martha was not her mother, but her half-sister, forced into the role of wife and mother to cover the true nature of the family's breeding program. The air carried the smell of wet earth and something metallic that made dogs refuse to walk near the property line. By summer, Sarah realized she was pregnant. The child growing inside her would be the product of a union between father and daughter, adding another generation to a bloodline that had become so tangled that genetic abnormalities were inevitable. She had seen the results in Elizabeth's delayed development, in Thomas's increasingly erratic behavior, in her own difficulty learning to read and write despite her intelligence. The local church records, which Sarah managed to examine during a rare trip to town, showed that several ministers over the years had been aware of the Whitmore family's practices. Notes in the margins of baptismal records indicated concerns about the children's parentage, but no action had ever been taken. The isolation of the property and the family's reputation for violence had kept outsiders from interfering. Sarah began documenting everything she discovered, writing in a notebook she kept hidden beneath her mattress. She recorded dates, names, and relationships, creating a family tree that looked more like a medical textbook illustration of genetic disasters than a normal genealogy. She hoped someone would eventually find these records and understand what had happened in Cedar Hollow. During the autumn of 1893, Sarah attempted to escape the property. She waited for a night when Joshua was away, checking fence lines, packed a small bag with her notebook and what little money she could find, and set off through the woods toward town. The October cold nearly killed her, and after 3 days without food or proper shelter, she was forced to return, weaker and more desperate than before. The air carried the smell of wet earth and something metallic that made dogs refuse to walk near the property line. Her child was born in the spring of 1894 without medical assistance. The labor lasted 36 hours, and the baby emerged with visible deformities that became more apparent in the weeks following birth. One arm shorter than the other, eyes that didn't track properly, and a cry that sounded more animal than human. Sarah knew this child would live a life of suffering because of decisions made generations before her birth. The house began showing signs of neglect that mirrored the family's deterioration. Paint peeled from the walls, windows cracked without being repaired, and weeds grew wild in what had once been carefully tended gardens. The 17 windows that had once let light into every room were gradually boarded over, leaving the interior in perpetual twilight. During the final months, documented in Sarah's notebook, Joshua's behavior became increasingly erratic. He would disappear for days at a time, returning with wild stories about preserving the family line and following God's will. He spoke of biblical precedents for marriage between close relatives and claimed the Whitmore bloodline was special, chosen for some divine purpose that required isolation from the contaminating influence of outsiders. The last entry in Sarah's notebook, dated March 15, 1895, described her decision to end the cycle. She had realized that as long as the family remained isolated and continued their practices, each generation would produce more damaged children who would grow up to repeat the same patterns. She planned to take Elizabeth and leave the property permanently, even if it meant walking to Nashville and appealing to state authorities for help. The notebook was found years later by a land surveyor working in Cedar Hollow after the property had been abandoned. Local records showed that no member of the Whitmore family had been seen after the spring of 1895. The house had been left exactly as they had lived in it, with dishes still on the table, clothes hanging in wardrobes, and that chest of women's belongings still buried in the cellar floor. The surveyor who found the notebook reported it to county authorities. But by then, all the people mentioned in Sarah's account were either dead or had moved away from the area. The case was filed as a historical curiosity rather than an active investigation, and the notebook eventually made its way to the Tennessee State Archives, where it remains in a collection of unusual family documents. Modern genetic research has confirmed that the type of inbreeding described in Sarah's account would indeed produce the developmental problems and physical deformities she documented. Medical experts who have reviewed the notebook say the Whitmore family represents one of the most extreme cases of deliberate inbreeding in American history, comparable to isolated populations studied by researchers interested in genetic disorders. The property itself was eventually sold to a timber company that cleared most of the old-growth forest. The house was demolished in 1923, but workers reported finding additional documents and personal belongings buried throughout the property. Most of these items were destroyed rather than preserved, following a local superstition that the Whitmore family had been cursed and their possessions should not be disturbed. Visitors to Cedar Hollow today can still find the foundations of the old Whitmore house, overgrown with Virginia creeper and marked by a historical society plaque that gives only the most basic information about the property's history. The plaque mentions that the Whitmore family lived there from 1820 to 1895, but provides no details about why they disappeared or what happened during their final years. To this day, no one knows whether the story of the Whitmore family truly happened, or if it is merely a rural legend passed down through generations in Tennessee's isolated mountains. But the whispers still echo through Cedar Hollow's fog-shrouded valleys, reminding locals of the dangers of family secrets kept too long in the shadow of time-forgotten mountains. The lesson here transcends mere historical curiosity and speaks to something deeper about human nature and the consequences of isolation. When families or communities cut themselves off from outside influence and accountability, when tradition becomes more important than the welfare of children, when secrecy protects the powerful at the expense of the innocent, the results can be devastating across generations. Sarah Whitmore's story, whether true or legend, reminds us that darkness grows in isolation, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is break the cycle of family secrets, no matter the cost. What do you think? Was this a real case buried by history, or just mountain folklore that captured fears about what happens when families become too isolated from the world? Share your thoughts in the comments below.